Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar. My name's Maxine Wall and I'm Head of Education and Training at the SRA, and I'll be your chair for today's webinar. Now, those of you that have seen me do a webinar or an online SRA event before will know that I do have a quite terrifying cat that likes to come and visit me sometimes when I'm doing these events. And when she comes to visit me, sometimes she does like to bite at my ankles. So if you see me behaving slightly oddly during the webinar, please don't be alarmed. It will just be the cat come to see what's going on. Hopefully it won't happen. Now, just to make sure that you're all on the right webinar, the purpose of this webinar is to explain what qualified lawyers need to do if they want to become a solicitor in England and Wales. But before we get into the content of the webinar, there's a couple of things just for me to run through with you. Now, we really want this session to be as interactive as possible. We've already had lots of questions in advance, and we'll be picking some of those questions up as we go through the webinar. But you can also submit questions in online by clicking on the question link below this video. And you can choose whether you include your name with those questions or whether you ask the question anonymously. It's completely up to you. And we'll try and answer your questions as we go through the webinar. One thing I would say is we won't get to probably answer all of your questions, but we'll do our best to answer those that we can. The other thing that I will say is we've already had lots of questions from people with very individual and very personal queries, and we won't be able to deal with those in the webinar, but hopefully you'll still find this webinar useful and you'll be able to find the information that you need on our website. And the other area that we've already had quite a lot of questions about is about training courses and where people can get training courses. Again, we won't be covering those types of questions in this session today because that's not really the purpose of this webinar. And then the final thing to say before we get into the webinar itself is that this stream will be available on catch up straight after the session. So please do feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues if you think they may find it useful. So today I am joined by my colleagues Carol Cook, Tim Pearce and Natalie Darby. And I'll be asking them a series of questions throughout this session about qualified lawyers. Now, you will all know that in 2021, we introduced a new way to qualify as a solicitor in England and Wales. And since we introduced that new system for qualifying, we get lots and lots of questions from qualified lawyers about how to qualify in England and Wales. And in particular, we get lots of questions about how to apply for exemptions from the solicitor's qualifying exam. So quite a lot of this webinar will focus on exemptions and how to get exemptions, but it won't just be about exemptions. We'll also cover what a qualified lawyer needs to do if they want to practice in England and Wales. And we'll also give you a bit of background to the solicitor's qualifying exam as well. So Carol, let's kick off with you. As a starting point, can you tell us what are the requirements for anyone who is a qualified lawyer who wants to qualify in England and Wales as a solicitor?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Maxine. So first of all, we require a degree in any subject. So it doesn't have to be a law degree. The key thing is that it's a level 6 qualification. That will usually be a bachelor's degree from a university, but it could be something equivalent to that. So, for example, a SILEX level 6 qualification would be equivalent to a university degree. And that's something we would check at admission stage. There's also a requirement to pass SQE, and I'll talk a wee bit about that in a moment. Unless, of course, you have an exemption from some or all of SQE, and I will talk about that a wee bit later on too. You've got to meet our requirements for character and suitability. And there is a requirement for 2 years qualifying work experience, but that does not apply to qualified lawyers. So qualified lawyers do not have to have 2 years qualifying work experience.
Thanks, Carol. Now, we've talked quite a lot already about qualified lawyers. I guess it would be helpful for us to explain what do we mean by a qualified lawyer?
Yes, sure. So a qualified lawyer is someone who holds a professional legal qualification that we recognise, which confers practice rights in England and Wales or outside of England and Wales. So, for example, it could be a barrister of England and Wales, it could be a Scottish solicitor, and outside of England and Wales, well, there are numerous examples, but ones that come to mind are, for example, Danish advocates, Italian advocatos, and we have a list of those that we have already recognised on our website. Again, to come on to that later. But the key thing is it's a professional legal qualification which confers practice rights that we recognise.
Thanks, Carol. So, as you said, we're going to talk about exemptions later in the session. Can you start by giving us just a brief outline, and I think we've got a slide that covers this, of what this solicitor's qualifying exam is and what does it cover?
Yes, sure. So first thing is SQE is in two parts. So the first part is SQE1, and SQE1 has two parts to it. So it has functioning legal knowledge 1, functioning legal knowledge 2. That's a bit of a mouthful, so we just abbreviate it to FLK1, FLK2. The point FLK or SQE1 is essentially a test of an individual's ability to apply the law of England and Wales to realistic client-based scenarios. So we are looking for evidence that you can use your legal knowledge and you can apply it correctly and appropriately to the sorts of transactions and matters upon which clients seek advice. So FLK1 covers areas such as contract law, tort, business law, legal services, and FLK2 covers criminal law, property practice, criminal litigation. It's much more expansive than that. I've just given you a little bit of an indication of the content, and there's lots and lots of detail on the SQE website, and we'll post details of that right at the very end. And there's a full assessment specification on the website, so that tells you what's assessed and how it is assessed. SQE1 is taken online over 2 days. It's tested by way of online multiple choice tests, and it can be taken in test centres in the UK or in a number of test centres overseas. So that's SQE1. If we can move on to SQE2, so having passed SQE1, an individual then has to go on and take SQE2 and pass that. And SQE2 is a test of, it's a combination of practical legal skills and functioning legal knowledge, again, to establish competence to exercise the practice rights that are conferred on an individual at the point of qualification. So they simulate tasks carried out by a solicitor in practice through written tests and oral tests. So the written tests are legal writing, legal drafting, case and matter analysis, legal research, exactly the sorts of tasks and skills that you would expect to see typically in your work as a solicitor. The oral tests are advocacy and interviewing, and the skills are assessed through the practice areas of business law, criminal litigation, dispute resolution, and wills and probate. Again, they very much align to the practice rights which are conferred at the point of qualification. And that's the assurance that we need, that you are competent, that you have demonstrated that you are competent to exercise those practice rights through passing SQE2. Again, lots and lots of detail on the website, which again we'll post at the very end. Written can be taken in the same test centres largely that SQE1 can be taken in. The oral test takes place only in the UK, so in test centres in Cardiff, Manchester and London.
So you mentioned, Carol, there practice rights and the practice rights that are granted to solicitors in England and Wales. I think we've got a slide on this, but can you explain what we mean by those practice rights?
Okay, yeah. So I think here we go. So and these are also very relevant to anyone who might think that they wish to apply for an exemption from part of SQE. So the practice rights which are conferred on solicitors of England and Wales are the right to conduct criminal litigation, and that includes advising clients at the police station, the conduct of civil litigation or dispute resolution, again in the courts of England and Wales, property practice, so the right to advise and prepare all the documentation and deal in the transfer of property, wills, intestacy, probate, administration and practice, so related to drafting wills, obtaining grants of probate, dealing with contested probate matters, for example, and then business organisations, rules and procedures. So those are the practice rights that are conferred on a solicitor at the point of admission. And of course, you will see when you look more closely at the SQE that the SQE assessment is aligned to giving us an assurance of competence in those areas.
And we'll come back to those practice rights later, Carol, won't we, when we talk about exemptions and why those practice rights are important.
Sure.
But before we do that, let me move across to Natalie. Natalie, we get quite a lot of questions from qualified lawyers who want to work in legal services in England and Wales. So can you talk us through how qualified lawyers can work in England and Wales? And again, I think we've got a slide that covers this.
Sure. Before I go through the different types of lawyers that can work in the legal services in England and Wales, I just want to make a note about the term and the title of lawyer, which is not legally protected in the UK. So what that means is effectively anyone can use the term lawyer as their job title, and that differs from some of the other types of terms that we're going to look at when I cover the different types of lawyers in the market. So first of all, solicitors, who we regulate. So it's the title solicitor, unlike lawyer, is protected by law across all the countries of the UK. And it means you can only legally refer to yourself as a solicitor if you're authorised by us, for example. So solicitors are authorised to provide legal services to members of the public in different ways. They often do so through working in a law firm, but we've also got a number of solicitors who work in different ways, for example, in-house, where they provide legal services to their employer. As well as offering general legal advice and representation on some of the most common legal matters, there are some legal services that are protected by legislation, and that they are known as reserved activities, and they can only be carried out by solicitors and other regulated lawyers. And they include things such as the conduct of litigation and exercising rights of audience, for example, issuing proceedings before a court, probate activities, for example, preparing probate papers, certain reserved instrument activities that often relate to transference of land, notarial activities, and the administration of oaths as well. So there are two legal activities that you must be regulated by a suitable regulator to carry out, and the SRA is one of those regulators, and that is in relation to immigration advice, which is restricted to certain regulated individuals, and claims management services as well. So I've talked a little bit about solicitors and what they can do. We also have other types of regulated lawyers. Some of their professional titles are also protected by law, such as barristers, and authorisation from a suitable regulator is required to work in those areas. Some legal services are also reserved to those other types of regulated lawyers. So, for example, the rights of audience, which is relevant, of course, to barristers, for example. There are also people who work as non-regulated lawyers in the legal services market. So while they cannot provide legal services that are restricted to regulated lawyers, they can provide general legal advice. So, for example, it's possible for people to provide will writing services without needing to be regulated by the SRA or another regulator. And that sort of goes back to that point that I was making about the term lawyer. So it might be that they sort of use that term when they're providing such services. And then in the law firms that we regulate, there's also a variety of different roles that people might have. For example, paralegals, legal secretaries, and legal advisors. None of these are sort of protected professional titles in law, but these sorts of individuals may work quite closely with solicitors and other regulated lawyers in the delivery of legal services to the public.
Thanks, Natalie. So if you're a qualified lawyer and you're already living in England and Wales and you want to practice as a lawyer, what are your different options for that?
So you could continue to refer to yourself using the title from your home jurisdiction, or you could refer to yourself as a lawyer or a legal advisor, for example. You could also perhaps work for a UK-based business as a legal advisor, or explore setting up a business that provides legal advice to members of the public. So there are quite a few businesses like this operating across England and Wales, such as those that provide will writing services. But it's important to sort of really draw out that you wouldn't be able to provide any legal services that are restricted to regulated individuals. For example, some of the reserved services that I've mentioned before, such as the conduct of litigation. Another option might be to register with a regulator such as the SRA, which would mean you would become a registered foreign lawyer, sometimes abbreviated to RFL for short. And essentially that would enable you to be authorised to provide some additional legal services, such as assisting with the conduct of litigation. So just a note on what an RFL is. So an RFL is a person who is not a solicitor of England and Wales or a barrister, but who is a member and entitled to practice as such of a legal profession regulated within a jurisdiction outside of England and Wales. So there are a number of approved professions on the SRA's list for RFL status. So if your country is on that list, you can apply to the SRA to be registered. So as part of this option, so if you are thinking of applying, you would need to provide us with a certificate of good standing from your regulator to show that you're admitted in your own jurisdiction and you don't have any disciplinary issues. So if you have any difficulty in obtaining this, I would say don't be put off. We do tend to look at cases on an individual basis. And if you contact us to become an RFL, we can work with you throughout the process as you go through it. If you're thinking you'll be located in Scotland or Northern Ireland, it's worth mentioning that there are different regulatory bodies there that you'll need to contact to discuss your options. And a further option to explore is really to become a solicitor or other regulated lawyer. So that involves the SQE. So Carol's already talked about the stages of that you would need to go through. And of course, there's also the exemptions that might be applicable if you hold a legal professional qualification that we recognise and that you can demonstrate that your qualifications are not substantially different in content from the SQE. So again, we understand that providing the documentation and evidence may be tricky. So if this is a route that's of interest to you, then please do come and talk to us. So other regulators, of course, have their own qualification pathways. So, for example, SILEX regulation sets out the qualification routes for people who want to become legal executives. So it's worth having a look at, for example, the Legal Choices website and the types of lawyers that is covered on that to sort of get a feel for the different types as well.
Thanks very much, Natalie. So quite a lot of information in what you've said, all really helpful. as you say, there's lots of information on our website, and I know when we get to the end of the session, we've got a slide with some links for people where they can find relevant information. Let's move on then now to talk about exemptions. We've mentioned them a little bit, but let's move on to you, Carol. You've already explained that qualified lawyers are required to take the SQE, but we get lots of queries about who's eligible for exemption and how does the exemption system work. So, Carol, can you explain to us what exemptions are available to qualified lawyers?
Yeah, sure. I'll give an overview here, Maxine, because Tim is going to talk more specifically about the application process and how to evidence our requirements. But the first thing to note is that if you're a qualified lawyer, you are eligible for exemption from SQE. Now that means you are eligible, provided you meet our requirements for exemption from FLK1 or FLK2 or both in SQE1 and all of SQE2. So there is no exemption from individual parts. So it's not possible, for example, to obtain exemption from all of the dispute resolution elements of the assessment. They're not divisible in that way. In order to get exemption, then a qualified lawyer has to demonstrate to us, or has to evidence to us through the application process, that the qualification that they have and or the experience upon which they are relying is equivalent in both content and standard for the assessment for which the exemption applies. So by content, we mean that the law is that they have applied in their practice is not substantially different to the law of England and Wales. And by standard, we mean that it's legal knowledge that is applied at the standard of a newly qualified solicitor. In the assessment specification, we refer to it as the threshold standard. So this is the standard of competence we require for admission as a solicitor. So it's the standard of a newly qualified solicitor. You're going to get fed up of me saying this, but there's lots of information on the website, and again, there's some links to that content at the end. So all qualified lawyers can apply for individual exemption based on their qualification and experience. It is possible, I know we've had a couple of questions about this, to apply for exemption from SQE2, for example, before sitting SQE1. And the reason I say that is because it's the requirements for exemption from both are very different, and it's easier, for want of a better word, to obtain exemption from SQE2 because it's very, very much based on the practice rights that a qualified lawyer holds than it is to get exemption from SQE1. And again, I'll explain that in a wee bit later on. And I sort of think I don't really want to say anything more really on that, Maxine, at this point, because I think, one, there's a lot of detail, and I think the key things are really, one is that you're eligible if you're a qualified lawyer. Secondly, you would need to meet our requirements for content and standard. And thirdly, I think the key point is that there are no exemptions from individual components or subject areas of SQE.
Thanks, Carol. And just to be clear, there is often quite a lot of confusion about whether we still recognise jurisdictions for the purposes of exemptions, and we don't, do we?
No, yeah, good. Thanks for reminding me, Maxine. No, that's right. We used to, under the old regime, we used to recognise the jurisdiction. Now the focus is very much on the qualification held by the individual.
Thanks, Carol. But having said that, although we don't recognise jurisdictions, we do on our website have a list of exemptions that we've already agreed, don't we? Can you explain about that to us?
Yes, I can. So an agreed exemption is one that will apply to all individuals who hold that particular qualification. And it's part of our work on sort of removing barriers, making sure that we don't have unnecessary regulation. So where we have assessed a qualification, and that qualification confers the same practice rights as a solicitor of England and Wales. So all of those practice rights that I referred to earlier and Natalie referred to, that there's confirmation from the regulator or the bar or the law society which regulates that particular qualification, that in the grant of those practice rights there will have been confirmation of competence in the skills assessed in SQE2, and where there's 2 years mandatory work experience as part of the qualification. If those requirements are met, then any qualified lawyer holding that qualification will be entitled to exemption from SQE2. And it's very much a sort of a shorter process for reaching those decisions. One point to note, though, is that in order to take the advantage of an agreed exemption, it's important that the individual has followed the full route to qualification in that particular country, or in the achievement, if you like, of that qualification. So it wouldn't apply to a qualified lawyer who's cross-qualified into that jurisdiction from another jurisdiction. However, if you have cross-qualified from one jurisdiction into another, you can still absolutely make an exemption for an application for exemption, but it wouldn't be an agreed exemption.
So that's SQE2 exemptions, Carol. You've already said that it's harder to get an exemption from SQE1, but I know we do get lots of applications in for people for exemption from SQE1. So can you explain to us how the SQE1 exemption works, please?
Yeah, sure. Whereas SQE2 focuses on the practice rights and the competencies achieved in or demonstrated in the grant of those practice rights, SQE1 is very much grounded in the knowledge and application of the law of England and Wales. And so it's very hard for an individual who has not studied and worked with the law of England and Wales to demonstrate that the breadth and depth of their legal knowledge is not substantially different to the breadth and depth of knowledge assessed in SQE1. We have had lots of applications. We have granted one exemption from SQE1 so far. And so the bar is very, very high in the sense of it's incumbent upon an individual applying for exemption from SQE1 to demonstrate that they have that breadth and depth of legal knowledge, and also that they've applied it to the standard of a newly qualified solicitor. So it's not impossible. The very fact that we have granted one demonstrates that it's not impossible, but it is a sort of it's a high bar, really. And of course you'll know from what Tim is going to talk to you later about the evidence that has to be provided in order to demonstrate sort of objectively that requirement has been met. I hope that helps. I don't want to give you the impression that that we've lowered the bar for SQE2. We haven't. It's just that the assurances we require for SQE1 exemption and SQE2 exemption, the focus is very, very different.
Thanks, Carol. So, Tim, let's move over to you now. If somebody wants to apply for an exemption, I know you work really closely with the team that deals with these applications. Can you tell people what they need to do if they want to apply for an exemption?
Yes, I'll explain what people need to do. The first thing that you need to do is to make sure that you have a My SRA account. Now, if you haven't already got a My SRA account, then it's very easy to create one. If you look at any page of our website, you'll see a small little box at the top of the page which says My SRA, and you click on that. That will take you to a login page. There you've got an option to click Create an Account. And then you'll simply need to enter some basic details, and you'll need to verify, and then you'll need to go through a verification process. It's very straightforward. So, My SRA accounts are not limited to solicitors or law students. Anyone can create a My SRA account. Once you've got a My SRA account, or if you've already got one, then if you go into it, you should then select Start a New Application. And that will bring up a list of the applications that you can make to us. And you select the option to apply for, and it's called Qualified Lawyers Application for Recognition of Professional Qualifications and Experience. That will then allow you to download the application form. Now, at this stage, when you've got the form downloaded, I think the important thing at that point is to go back to our website, look at the guidance, read the guidance, and then complete the form, making sure that you're completing it in line with our guidance. Then you go back to My SRA, and it will allow you then to upload your completed form, which will then be passed through to us, and you can support your application. You can upload evidence of your qualification and your admission as a lawyer in your own home jurisdiction. And you can upload references and other materials to support the evidence of your work experience. It also allows you to pay the fee. The fee is £265. And what you should be aware of is that we can't tell you until you make an application whether you're going to get one. You need to actually make the application. We need to see your form and your supporting evidence, and then we make a judgment on your case.
And that's a really important point, Tim, isn't it? Because we do get quite a lot of people who contact us saying, I'm thinking about putting an application in. This is my situation. Will I get an exemption? And we simply can't tell people without receiving the application form and the necessary information to make that judgment. So I think that's really important for people to note that. We've already said, Tim, that we've received a really high number of applications for exemptions already, and you've been really closely involved with this, so you must have a pretty good idea already about what makes a good application. So can you tell us what are your top tips for somebody who's thinking about completing one?
Yes. My absolute number one top tip is to read our web guidance. All the guidance that we've put on our website, which is in the qualified lawyers area, so you go to becoming a solicitor on the website, and then you go to, and then that gives you an option there, qualified lawyers, and you go into that section. All the guidance that's there is there to help you complete the application form. And we have used our experience of dealing with applications and assembling the evidence on a case-by-case basis for these exemptions to develop and refine that guidance so it's as practical and helpful as possible. So that's my first point, is please read the guidance. It will help you. The next thing to do is just to check the website. Again, this is very clearly labelled in the qualified lawyers section. Check the website for agreed exemptions and the list of other qualifications that we have considered but that don't have an exemption. But remember that even if your qualifications or your jurisdiction is not on either of those lists, you can still make an individual application. As Carol said, it's about your qualification, and that's what we look at. Not, we don't have a list of recognised jurisdictions anymore that we use. So anyone who is a qualified lawyer can apply. Then you need to read the application form carefully and really think about what the application is asking you. Can you actually meet the requirements that we're asking for? For example, for SQE2, do you have those practice rights that Carol mentioned? If you don't, then you might need to reconsider as to whether you should be actually making an application to us for an exemption. Another thing is this that is really important to stress, and is really good to bear in mind when you're filling in the form. The process is very evidence-based. So, for example, if you're putting about your professional experience, don't just state that you have experience. We need you to be specific about what experience you've got, and you need to show us how that experience meets our criteria. Also, because it's evidence-based, you need to remember that any work experience that you mention on your form needs to be corroborated, ideally by a supervisor or a colleague that you work alongside. If you're a partner in a firm, then another partner in that firm, perhaps. But the references, again, there's detailed guidance as to what information we need in our references. We don't give a sample or a template reference, but we do set out very carefully what information you need to put, that a referee needs to put, in order that we have got properly corroborated evidence of your work experience. The same with your any certificates, qualifications, etc. We need to know that you are qualified as a lawyer. That includes, will typically include an admission certificate. If you have passed bar exams in order to qualify as a lawyer, we need to know not just that you've passed those exams, but also that you've actually got an admission certificate to be admitted and practice as a lawyer in your home jurisdiction. And you need to complete, when you come to any section of the form, think, am I repeating something that I've put elsewhere? This is not about cutting and pasting the same bits of evidence in different parts of the form. It's about thinking about each section of the form and making sure that what you put actually addresses that. And finally, if you are one of those who feels you could apply for an exemption from SQE1, the knowledge assessment, then there are a few extra points, because as mentioned, this is a slightly more demanding evidence process than for SQE2. You need to make sure there's a table on the form which you will need to fill in carefully and provide a specific example for each of the outcomes in terms of the different areas of law, such as business law, contract law, and so on. Each of those outcomes you'll need to provide specific examples for. Remember that we can't grant partial exemptions from parts of FLK1 or FLK2 within SQE1. So evidence that, for instance, you practiced in business law, you may have marvellous evidence for that, but unless you can show the other areas within FLK1 or the part of SQE1 that you're applying for, then you maybe ought to reconsider and think, is this a realistic thing? I think Carol has mentioned there are no agreed exemptions from SQE1. We recognise a number of jurisdictions and qualifications for the purpose of SQE2, but not any for SQE1. And an SQE1 application will take at least 180 days to assess and make a decision, because obviously there is a large amount of evidence and information if we are actually comparing your legal knowledge through your qualification experience to everything that is tested on SQE1, which is broadly the law of England and Wales.
Thanks very much, Tim. And before we move on to the next question, I've just been prompted to remind people that the name of the application form that you need to complete, or if you want to apply for an exemption, is on one of the slides that we had up in this session. So please do refer to that link in that name of the form in the slide if you want to apply for an exemption application. So we've talked about SQE2 and we've talked about SQE2 agreed exemptions, but what about somebody who wants to apply from SQE2, but we don't have an agreed exemption for that qualification? What does that person need to do?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the first thing that that someone who is thinking about doing the SQE needs to note, and Carol has mentioned this already, is that you do not need to wait until you've passed SQE1 to apply for an SQE2 exemption. You can apply at any time and, as it were, use it later. Now, if you want to apply and your qualification doesn't have an agreed exemption, you'll need to provide us with evidence of your qualification in the jurisdiction you have applied, that you are qualified in. And as I mentioned, we would normally need an admission certificate. You also need to verify your work experience. Quite often, we have not been able to grant an agreed exemption to a jurisdiction because that jurisdiction may not have a work experience requirement or have a very short work experience requirement prior to qualification. So you may well be looking at having to verify your work experience so that we know that you have a reasonable amount of experience, normally 2 years, normally at least 2 years, if you want an individual exemption from SQE2. But do remember that we deal with all applications on a case-by-case basis. So, present us with your evidence, we will review it. As I mentioned, work experience needs to be supported by a reference. The reference must meet the criteria and follow the guidance that is on our website. Obviously, we recognise that in very many cases, your referee at your home firm will obviously not be a solicitor of England and Wales. So they will be a lawyer of your home jurisdiction. In order to know the authenticity of your referee, we will require a certificate of good standing in relation to them, which can be provided by their home regulator. So you normally a bar or a local law society in that jurisdiction. And if you do have, if your jurisdiction is not on either the agreed list or the list of qualifications we have considered, then it's very useful for us if you have a specific contact at your home regulator and they're a regulator we have not yet dealt with, then please put that on their application form, because then we can use that contact to contact them and speed up the process.
Thanks, Tim. And you mentioned their certificates of good standing, which we require from anybody who's confirming work experience, but also we need certificates of good standing, don't we, for qualified lawyers when they come to us and apply to become a solicitor?
That's right, yes. The certificates of good standing, we require those at the point of admission. So you can't. So although you may have passed the SQE or had exemptions from it, you can't actually be admitted as a solicitor. At that point, we will actually ask for a certificate of good standing for the jurisdictions where you hold a professional legal qualification and where you've been admitted. And we need to know it's current as well. Your certificate of good standing must be less than 3 months old. Now, for anyone out there who is not familiar with this term, certificates of good standing, do be reassured they are an internationally recognised system used between all the bars and law societies of the world. So your home regulator will know about them, even if the term is unfamiliar to you at the moment.
Thanks, Tim. So there's a lot of information, isn't there, that we need in order to consider an application for exemption. Lots of things for people to think about. But obviously, it's really important that we get all this information, because these are really important decisions that we're making when we make an exemption application decision. And sometimes I know we get in applications that don't have all the necessary information that we need. What happens, Tim, if we get an application that doesn't have the necessary information?
Yeah, if an application doesn't contain all the information that we need, we won't be able to assess it. So what we would do in that case is we will return you the application and we will refund you the fee. So that doesn't prevent you making a further application at a later stage, but clearly it is much better if you can read the guidance and make sure that you can provide us all the information in the first place.
Thank you, Tim. And just one final question from you. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground here on exemptions, but is there anything else that it would be useful for people to know?
Yes, there's one other thing that's well worth noting. If you're a qualified lawyer and you're granted an exemption from the SQE2, as you probably have noted from previous slides, the SQE2 is a written and an oral test. So if you have gained an exemption from it, then you won't have had that written and oral test when you come to the point of admission. Now, one of the things that we need to know is that you are competent in the language of either English or Welsh. So we have the opportunity to check if we have serious and concrete doubts about your language competence. We can make a check, and we make that check after admission as a solicitor, but before your first practicing certificate as a solicitor is issued to you. Now, if you are one of those who comes into that category, then we have on our website a list of the ways that you can demonstrate your competence in English or Welsh to us. One of them, which commonly applies, is that if your degree was taught and assessed in English or Welsh, we will take that as evidence that you are competent at the right standard. Another thing you can do is you can do a language test. And again, there is links and explanation about that. So you can gain effectively a certification through a language testing process to say, I am competent in English or Welsh.
Thanks, Tim. Let's move on now from exemptions. Let's move back to you, Carol. So when we introduced the Solicitors Qualifying Exam in 2021, it replaced other former routes to qualification, including the Qualified Lawyers Transfer Scheme, which was the route for qualified lawyers before we introduced the SQE. And we've got transitional arrangements in place for qualified lawyers who were partway through the QLTS, as we called it, before the SQE was introduced. Can you explain what those transitional arrangements are, Carol? Because I know people are usually very interested in this.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, like you say, Maxine, SQE has replaced QLTS. So SQE is the exam for everyone, and there's not a separate assessment for qualified lawyers. If you're a qualified lawyer and you hadn't started on the QLTS route, so you haven't taken and passed the multiple choice test, for example, then you will need to pass SQE in the same way as all individuals who want to qualify as a solicitor. If you've passed the multiple choice test, so you started to qualify via the QLTS route when we introduced SQE, then we have a transitional window which allows you to complete that route by taking SQE2. So if you've got the multiple choice test from QLTS and you don't have to do SQE1, but you must do SQE2, but you have to complete it within the transitional window. And that means you must apply for admission by no later than the 31st of March 2024. Now, what that means is there is there are still opportunities for you to complete your journey, if you like, to qualification through the transitional window, but you will only have a few attempts left because of the requirement to seek admission by the 31st of March 2024. So there's a limited number of SQE2 sittings that are left within the transitional window, and all the details for that are on the times and dates arrangements on the SQE website. Again, at the risk of being really boring on this point, there's lots and lots of information on the web about this, and with the booking dates and venues and so on and so forth. So if you are intent on completing your route to qualification through the QLTS transitional window, then I would urge you to just really get a leg on and look at that really very, very soon, because the opportunity will close.
Thanks, Carol. I'm just going to ask one final question because I'm conscious that we're slightly running out of time, but I want to ask this question, Carol, because I know we get lots of queries about this. Get queries from people who have already got the QLTS multiple choice test, or they've got the legal practice course, and they want to know whether they can get exemptions if they've got those qualifications.
Right, so they will not get an exemption simply on the basis that they have either the LPC or the multiple choice test from QLTS. And the reasons for that are that neither of them map completely, either in content and standard, to SQE1 or SQE2. So take the legal practice course, for example. There are lots and lots of elements of law studied and assessed in the LPC, which are also assessed in SQE. However, the legal practice course is not a point of entry qualification. It's a qualification that prepares an individual to start a period of training. So it is not set at the same standard as SQE. The MCT, we've mapped the MCT against SQE, and there are elements of it which are of the same standard, but there are many areas, particularly the practice areas, which are assessed in SQE, which were not assessed in the multiple choice test. So on their own, neither of those qualifications would entitle someone to exemption unless they actually fall within the transitional window.
Thanks very much, Carol. So I want to move on now to some of the questions that we've had either in advance or through this session. We've had quite a lot, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. Let's start with you, Carol. We get lots of questions from lawyers saying that they're really experienced lawyers, and so can they get an exemption from SQE on the basis of the fact that they're a very experienced senior lawyer?
No, not just on that basis. I mean, their experience is obviously going to be incredibly helpful in demonstrating how they meet our requirements, but there's no sort of minimum or maximum period of work experience which on its own would entitle someone for exemption. But clearly it would be compelling, their experience would give them an opportunity to provide quite compelling evidence.
Thanks, Carol.
To meet our requirements.
Thank you. And Tim, we've had a question from Alex about the length of time it takes to process an SQE1 application. And the question is it ever possible that it could take less than 180 days to process an SQE1 application?
It's possible, but it's fairly unlikely. And the reason for that is that we have to do a mapping and comparison between the content of that individual's qualification and experience, and SQE 1, FLK 1 and FLK 2, which covers in effect almost all the law of England and Wales. So that is law across everything from, you know, sort of constitutional administrative law, sort of the legal framework, the court system, etc., right through to actual very practical functional law of how do I conduct a conveyancing process, how do I apply for a grant of probate, how do I act when I'm in the police station representing a client. It has to cover that breadth because we want to make sure that solicitors have the functioning knowledge to be competent in all those areas when we admit them as a solicitor. So it has to have that breadth. And we need to know, if you're going for an SQE2, SQE1 exemption, that your experience and knowledge actually matches that and is absolutely, you know, on a level with that. So that's why it takes, a very long time.
Thanks, Tim. And another question for you, which I think you can probably answer fairly quickly, that's come in today is, do you need to actually be practicing in your jurisdiction in order to apply for an exemption?
No, you don't. If you have been admitted as a lawyer, then that's what we say, and our regulations are very much based on the fact that it's about your qualification and your status as a lawyer. The same as if you were admitted as a solicitor here, and you were not practicing at the time, but your name's still on the roll, and you can still call yourself a solicitor.
Thank you. And one for you, Carol. We've had a question in from somebody who says, does your degree need to be in English to meet the degree or equivalent requirement?
No, it doesn't have to be in English to meet the requirements for a degree or equivalent level 6 qualification. It might help in terms of the sort of English language requirements, but we don't require that in terms of the level of the qualification.
Thank you. And moving on now, one for you, Natalie. We've had a question in from Andre. You have already touched on this, but the question is, what's the difference in the work that a registered foreign lawyer can do compared to a solicitor in England and Wales?
So I think it's worth saying that the work you can do is slightly more limited than if you were a fully qualified solicitor, but it does enable you to do specific activities. So, for example, you can assist with the conduct of litigation as long as you're under the instruction and supervision of a person who's entitled to do that. You are able to advise on English and Welsh law by providing unreserved legal services. But there are also some opportunities to carry out advocacy, for example, before a first-year immigration tribunal, along with the conduct and preparation of documents in relation to the proceedings. So in short, slightly more limited, but it does give you some additional options for things that you can do.
Thank you, Natalie. And I think we've got time for probably just one more question. I think it's a question for you, Tim. We get lots of people asking us, do we give exemptions from SQE to Commonwealth countries or to EU countries or to common law countries? Now, it doesn't work like that, does it?
It doesn't work like that. We are in very much in a sort of post-Brexit Britain is open for business world. We are in a world where we are looking at our criteria. Our criteria are very much based on the competence for people who become solicitors. That's in order that solicitors can provide good quality services to the public. So we have our criteria, and they are independent of any particular national status or group of nations. Having said that, we think that although this is it ensures a high standard, it also ensures openness, because you don't anymore have to be on any list of registered jurisdictions. Anyone who is a qualified lawyer in your home jurisdiction can apply.
Thanks very much, Tim. And thanks very much to all of our speakers, to Carol, Natalie and Wayne. We're going to close the webinar there. We have had quite a lot of questions in that we haven't had time to answer, and I can assure you we will look through them and we'll see if there's anything that we can cover in future webinars or anything that we can add to our website. On that note, we really want to hear what you thought about this webinar. So it would be really great if you could click on the evaluation link below this video stream and let us know what you think. It will literally take you 2 minutes to complete, and it will really help us with these types of events in the future. And finally, we've got 2 more slides at the end here, which give you details of where you can get some of the further information that we have mentioned through this webinar, and how you can contact us, and also details of where you can get more information about working in the UK. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found it useful. I, for one, am very grateful that the cat didn't join me, but I'm very grateful to you for joining us. So thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.